This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 293 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I've gotten a few emails this season about this 15 transaction show, and specifically adding to it. They're positive emails, and I really appreciate them. But the gist of each one is that the listener would like to hear the transaction, but then with each transaction, they want me to list players I'd be selling a particular player for. So if I say sell Julio Jones, which by the way, don't do that, but if I say sell Julio Jones, they want to know who I'd sell Julio Jones for. In theory, not a bad idea. The issue I have with it and why I've never done things that way is because I don't think that's the way that you should trade. Your consideration set for who you should buy should be huge, not small. You should be willing to take on a lot of players because a lot of players can help you win in fantasy football. When you trade, you should find teams who complement your team. If you're loaded at wide receiver and one of those receivers is a sell candidate on this show, then find a team who needs wide receivers and go from there. I try my best to say how I'm viewing each of these players every single week, so you guys know that I'm not just giving them up for peanuts. But that's the reason I haven't added that element to 15 transactions. And to be honest, the other reason is that I want the content that I produce to be educational more than just a list that you can work off of and win your league with. Like, I can read you a list of players to buy and sell each week and just be done with it. That would save me a hell of a lot of time. But that wouldn't enable any of you to understand the meaning behind those buys and sells. I'd also probably get fired because that's not how you produce good content. But without that meaning and that background as to why I'm buying and selling particular players, it does you no good when trying to win your fantasy leagues in the long run and over time. So that's my reasoning. Like I said, I appreciate all the emails about the topic, but I figured that I'd address it so everyone's aware. This is a 15 transactions day though, but before I get into the transactions, I wanted to remind you guys about OddsFire. Whether you're playing DFS or betting on sports, OddsFire is a key tool for your research. I can tell you guys that it's been a key tool for my research. Shop for the best lines in each market and see which side is getting the most bets and money. OddsFire is the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Check out the experience for free now on NumberFire or at oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Sell Austin Ekeler. So heading into week 5, Chargers head coach Anthony Lynn said, quote, "We have a plan for Melvin Gordon. I don't want to put him in there and play him too much. And I really don't have to. I like what Austin Ekeler has been doing in the backfield. Whenever he's ready to go, he will be the number one guy and get the bulk of the snaps. But obviously he's not there right now." Against the Broncos, we watched Melvin Gordon play about 46% of the Chargers snaps. Austin Ekeler was at roughly 66%. Now Melvin Gordon outrushed Ekeler 12-3, but Ekeler saw 16 targets in that negative game script that they faced against Denver. 16. He had 15 receptions. He was a top 10 running back in PPR formats this week. Now, aside from this outlier game that we saw from Austin Ekeler, this does seem right in line with what Anthony Lynn told reporters before this game, that Melvin Gordon wasn't going to see a full workload this week. But given Ekeler's performance, I think this is an opportunity to sell. Because when Gordon was active last year, Ekeler averaged around 9 touches per game. Now, Ekeler's performed well to start the season, so that number probably will increase just a bit. But we shouldn't expect Ekeler to just continue to outsnap Melvin Gordon. And we definitely shouldn't assume that Austin Ekeler is capable of maintaining a 34.8% target share. That's what he saw on Sunday. Now, Ekeler can be a lower-end RB2 in PPR formats. I've talked about that on this show in the past. But we've got more than 5 games worth of data showing us that Melvin Gordon is the unquestioned workhorse in the Chargers backfield. And it does seem like Anthony Lynn agrees. Buy Kyler Murray. I typically don't buy quarterbacks in fantasy football, but I'm not sure that people realize how good, or how decent at least, Kyler Murray has been in fantasy football to start the season. He's one of 3 quarterbacks along with Patrick Mahomes and Gardner Minshew to have scored 16 or more standard fantasy points in each of his first 5 games. Now, the big statistical difference between Kyler Murray and those quarterbacks is touchdown rate. Mahomes and Minshew are 12th and 13th in touchdown rate respectively. And touchdown rate, I'm referring to touchdowns divided by attempts. Kyler Murray only ranks better than the Miami quarterbacks and Luke Falk among relevant quarterbacks in touchdown rate. And touchdown rate generally regresses to the mean. Now, really good quarterbacks are going to have higher than average touchdown rates generally. That's what we see for players like Russell Wilson each and every year. But Kyler Murray's 2.0% rate is very, very low. Just to give you some context, no 200-plus attempt quarterback had a touchdown rate below 2.8 last season. Kyler Murray is at 2 right now. But what's really kept him going in fantasy football is his legs. Only Lamar Jackson has more rushing yards at quarterback than Kyler Murray, and Kyler Murray's found the end zone twice as a runner. So imagine what his numbers could look like with a normal touchdown rate. And not only that, but Arizona over the next 2 weeks, they get the Falcons and the Giants. Those are 2+ matchups. So Kyler Murray is a fantastic buy candidate, especially given the perception around him in that Arizona Cardinals offense. Buy Larry Fitzgerald. So it only makes sense to buy Kyler Murray's top target as well, and that's Larry Fitzgerald. He now has a 22.9% target share. That's a top 21 in the league, and that's in an offense that's now thrown the ball over 200 times. The Cardinals are just one of 4 teams with 200 or more pass attempts this year. A 23% piece of a large pie is a lot of targets for a guy like Larry Fitzgerald. So Fitzgerald's an incredibly safe option from a volume standpoint. And like I just talked about, Kyler Murray is a positive regression candidate in the touchdown column in that passing attack. So with those plus matchups coming, I think Larry Fitzgerald is also a good buy candidate. Drop O.J. Howard. I liked O.J. Howard entering the season. If you listen to this show, you know that. I don't hide from my bad takes. I'm going to have bad takes. I'm not going to predict everything right. I was wrong with O.J. Howard. And I think that you can drop him at this point. Howard does rank 12th in routes run at the tight end position according to Pro Football Focus. So I'm a little bit worried about outright dropping him in every single format no matter what. But he's seen just 8.8% of Tampa Bay's targets this season. He's ranked no higher than 15th in weekly tight end scoring after 5 games. It's just tough to trust O.J. Howard without that consistent volume. Add Ito Smith. Devontae Freeman finally found the end zone last week, which is great because I was talking about Freeman a lot on the show last week. But Ito Smith ended up playing 47.3% of Atlanta's snaps. That's his highest snap rate since week 1. Now, Freeman still saw pretty good usage. He had about 69%, nice, of the team's running back rushes and over 11% of Atlanta's targets. Those are pretty good numbers. But Ito Smith saw a season-high 13.6% target share to go along with his 5 carries. Now, I don't know how predictable this usage is going to be. I think if Atlanta's in a crazy negative game script, it could be an Ito Smith game, or he could be usable. And with bye weeks upcoming, you might need some running back depth. You might need a random fill-in running back. So I think that Ito Smith is worthwhile for that purpose. But then also, if something were to happen to Devontae Freeman, Ito Smith's workload would increase, but we would still probably see a committee in that backfield. Sell Mark Ingram. So I try to be clear with this 15 transaction show that when I say to sell someone, it doesn't mean that I think that they're worthless in fantasy football. Mark Ingram is not worthless in fantasy football, you guys. I'm just playing the market. And the market is probably pretty high on Mark Ingram because through 5 weeks, he's essentially been a high-end RB1 in fantasy football. But he's found the end zone 6 times this year when based on his rushing and receiving yardage total, he should have about half of that. Now, I'm looking at the last 5 years worth of data and seeing how running backs have scored given their rushing and receiving yardage totals. Now, even if you give Mark Ingram a little bit of a bump because he handles goal line work, he has 7 carries within the 5 this year, which is tied for the second most in football, he's still overperforming in the touchdown column. It's really hard to sell it any other way. And it's not as though Ingram has really great peripheral numbers. Over 20 running backs have a higher running back rushing share than Mark Ingram has. And his 5.5% target share ranks outside the top 45 at the position. Like I said, I think he's going to be a very usable piece in fantasy football moving forward. But I also don't think that it's likely that he's going to be this usable. So if you can get something significant for Mark Ingram right now, I'm all for it. Buy Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce has been one of the biggest touchdown underachievers to begin the 2019 season. He has 439 receiving yards. He should have 2.3 more touchdowns than he currently has as a result of that. And if he'd match that number, there wouldn't be a question as to who the tight end 1 in fantasy football is. But there is right now because Travis Kelce is underperforming. And it ties into how Patrick Mahomes is performing. Patrick Mahomes, even though he's still 12th in the NFL in touchdown rate, his touchdown rate should be higher because it's Patrick Mahomes. Mahomes should realistically have a couple more touchdowns, and that would help Travis Kelce. And we should just feel confident about Kelce's production moving forward anyway. He's got a 22.6% target share in that Kansas City offense, and he's yet to finish a single week with a target share lower than 20%. That's awesome at the tight end position. So if you can buy low on Travis Kelce, go for it. Add Chase Edmonds. So David Johnson was apparently dealing with back problems on Sunday, and that allowed Chase Edmonds to see the field for 35% of Arizona's snaps. He saw a season-high 8 rushes and 4 targets, and he also found the end zone. So if David Johnson misses time, Edmonds would be a huge help off the waiver wire. He's one of the best running back handcuffs in fantasy football. So add him now. Don't wait and see if David Johnson is healthy or not. Just add Edmonds off the waiver wire as soon as you can. Buy Josh Gordon. Josh Gordon has yet to rank better than wide receiver 29 in any week in PPR formats this year. But I like his peripheral numbers. Over the last 3 weeks, he's seen at least 20% of New England's targets in every single game. According to airyards.com, he's number 1 on the Patriots in air yards. And with just 1 touchdown, he's been a little bit underwhelming in the touchdown column. So there's enough there for me to think that Josh Gordon can rebound. So I would send a buy low offer. Hold or sell Will Fuller. So the immediate reaction to Will Fuller's insane performance on Sunday is probably to sell him. But the reason that performance happened, and the reason it wasn't totally unpredictable, remember, I talked about it on last week's matchup show, but the reason it wasn't totally unpredictable was because of his peripheral numbers entering week 5. He had 3 consecutive games of strong target share numbers, and he ranked 12th in the NFL in air yards. A big game from Will Fuller, who's a big play wide receiver, was bound to happen. But with that being said, let's take a step back. Kenny Stills didn't play on Sunday. Stills had seen the second highest average depth of target on the Texans before Sunday's game happened. So if they're throwing the ball down the field, it'll benefit Will Fuller more with Kenny Stills sidelined. But from weeks 1 through week 4, Fuller had 9 targets that traveled 15 or more air yards. Kenny Stills had 5. On Sunday, Will Fuller had 4 of those targets. And in that game on Sunday, Will Fuller also saw over 48% of Houston's targets. That's absolutely unheard of. So from the perspective of Will Fuller maintaining this pace, yeah, you can sell Will Fuller. There's 0 chance he's going to see that high of a target share week in and week out. He might not see that high of a target share, he probably won't, again in his entire career. But don't mistake this big Will Fuller game as a complete and total fluke. Now, to some degree it was. He's not going to repeat this performance. But plenty of numbers pointed to Will Fuller breaking out and having this game. He'll still be usable in fantasy football from here on out. Buy Royce Freeman. Phillip Lindsay has outscored Royce Freeman so far this year by about 30 fantasy points. That's in PPR formats. And really, it's mostly because of touchdowns. Lindsay's got 6 goal line rushes. Royce Freeman has 1. Phillip Lindsay has scored all 3 of his touchdowns from that area of the field. But don't let this overshadow the fact that the usage between Lindsay and Freeman hasn't been drastically different. Freeman's now seen 44.4% of Denver's running back carries. He's seen about 13% of the team's targets. Lindsay's at 55.7% of the running back rushes and about 14% of the team's targets. So just to reiterate, the big difference here is touchdowns. And again, Lindsay does have more goal line rushes than Royce Freeman does by a pretty significant margin. But he only has 3 more rushes from within the 10. So things could swing in the other direction, or at least more than it has to start the year. Don't get me wrong, I still like Phillip Lindsay more than Royce Freeman. But because of the lack of touchdowns, Royce Freeman right now is one of fantasy football's biggest positive touchdown regression candidate. And you only have to trade away bench players to get someone like Royce Freeman who could be a good bye-week filler. And if something were to happen to Phillip Lindsay, all of a sudden he's a weekly starter. Add Gerald Everett. So back on Thursday night, Gerald Everett went nuts. He caught 7 of 11 targets and he had 136 yards against that Seattle defense. He's now had back-to-back top 6 tight end performances. And he's tallied 19 targets over those 2 games. And he's also now seen a double-digit target share in 3 of 5 games played this year. So with tight end being a disaster, Gerald Everett's not a bad add off the waiver wire. Buy John Brown. I like buying players who are entering their bye week, especially if my team is set up well. If my team's sitting at 4-1 or 5-0 right now, I'm buying players who are on the bye. They're usually easier to trade for. And John Brown has been low-key pretty freaking good this year. He's seen at least 15% of Buffalo's targets in each game, and he ranks 9th in the NFL at wide receiver in receiving yard share. Meaning only 8 wide receivers have accounted for a higher percentage of their team's receiving yards than John Brown has. And after this week's bye, Buffalo has an amazing schedule. They get Miami in week 7, then Philadelphia, Washington, Cleveland, and then Miami again. That means 4 matchups in 5 games against teams who rank in the top 8 in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So sign me up for John Brown. Add Kyle Allen. If you're streaming quarterbacks, it's a pretty rough week for quarterback streamers. But Kyle Allen isn't in a terrible spot against Tampa Bay, because Tampa Bay has now given up a top 8 fantasy performance in each of their last 3 games, and 2 of those quarterbacks played way above their norm. Daniel Jones and Teddy Bridgewater were both top 5 options against the Buccaneers. So maybe Tampa Bay's secondary really is as bad as we thought it was entering the season. Add the Washington and Miami defenses. So like quarterback, defensive streamers aren't very easy to spot this week. So your best path to success might be to target that Washington-Miami game, as gross as it is to hear that. But Washington's a 3.5-point favorite over Miami according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and the over-under in that game is set at just 41 points. It's going to be a sloppy game, but that gives both defenses a pretty high floor. Now, I would prefer Washington because they're the better defensive unit in general. They actually have scored fantasy points this year. But Miami's actually a reasonable deep option if you're very, very desperate. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in the 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to sell Juju Smith-Schuster. The peripheral numbers aren't that bad for Juju. He's seen over 20% of Pittsburgh's targets. He ranks in the top 10 in receiving yard share. He hasn't been that bad, all things considered. But all things considered, the quarterback situation there is awful. And the fact that he's coming off a game with a touchdown, now's probably the time to just sell off Juju Smith-Schuster and not have to deal with the Steelers' offensive headache. It really could be a rough season for that offense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening, as always. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends Show.